The session you guys are joining today is motivational interviewing. We have Adrian Contreras and Robbyn Takeuchi from United Health who will be presenting on that topic. So I will hand it over to you, Robbyn, and you and Adrian can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Danny, and good morning, everyone. And I'm sorry my video is not working, so I'm the black screen that you see. Hopefully, maybe not hopefully, it'll come on later as I talk, but we'll just have to deal with this as it is. So as Danny mentioned, my name is Robbyn Takeuchi, and I'm the Behavioral Health Director at United Healthcare. And I'm joined today by Adrian Contreras, our Recovery and Resiliency Manager in our Behavioral Health Department. So I'll be kicking off our talk today mostly with an overview of some key concepts that will lay the foundation for Adrian, who will really get into more of the practical approaches of what motivational interviewing might look like when working with individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Before we get started, though, I first wanted to thank you for all that you do to support some of our most vulnerable members in the community. And certainly during these months in the pandemic, we have all been stretched in different ways in how we utilize technology, how we deliver services, and fundamentally how we interact with each other. And I think now more than ever, our ability to connect with people has been tested with so many changes in how we communicate and just the overwhelming stressors in life in this public health emergency. It's caused us all to look deeper within ourselves to really understand our values, to observe how they shape our decisions, and ultimately the effect our decisions have on those around us and our circumstances. In turn, I think it has also made us more mindful of these same processes that are in play for the clients we serve. So I know that the general concepts of motivational interviewing and core skills inherent to MI are very familiar to many of you, and there are countless trainings and books and articles related to motivational interviewing that I know you've all been offered or received in the past. And yet what we find is that there's still such an overwhelming demand for more information on MI. And the reasons for this, I think, isn't because folks don't understand or know the basic principles and skills of motivational interview. Rather, I think the challenge comes with the confidence in creating these skills into practice. And this will really get at the heart of what our session is about today. We're really just going to practice the skills you are probably already aware of and try to highlight them in the context in which might more readily come up for you when working in homeless services. So after that very long disclaimer that you already know all that you need to know about MI, this is our agenda for today. First, we'll review the purpose and learning objectives for today's training, along with some of the main takeaways we hope you leave with today. We'll then discuss some of the highlights of motivational interviewing, which will likely be a review of things like the spirit of MI and core practice skills. And finally, we'll take a look at some strategies for integrating these skills into practice through some case examples. The purpose of today's training is to support you in developing or more likely reinforcing basic proficiency in motivational interviewing. The objectives for today will be for you to be able to describe at least 2 strategies used in MI to create a safe space for your clients to explore ambivalence. You'll be able to identify at least 3 different roadblocks to active listening. And finally, you'll be able to identify and describe the core skills that are used in MI, otherwise known as ORs. Some key takeaways for today is acknowledging that ambivalence to change is not only normal, but it's expected. In fact, the bigger the change that needs to occur, the greater the ambivalence we can expect to experience. Understanding that motivational interviewing is not manipulating people to do what we want them to do. Rather, the real goal of MI is to help move people through ambivalence to be able to more clearly see all sides of the issue, the pros and cons of changing and not changing. And to do this, we must be sure to listen to understand rather than be understood. Our discussion today will hopefully reaffirm that values often guide our decisions about change. Motivational interviewing is not intended for all situations. Good active listening skills are always helpful in all types of interactions, but the specific approach to MI is not intended for all situations. So let's just start briefly at the beginning with a basic understanding of motivational interviewing. As many of you already know, the concept of MI evolved from experience in the treatment of problem drinkers and was first described by William Miller in an article published in 1983 in Behavioral Psychology. These fundamental concepts were later elaborated on in his work with fellow psychologist Stephen Rolnick in 1991 in a more detailed description of clinical procedures. It was defined at that time as a directive, client-centered counseling style for eliciting behavior change by helping clients to explore and resolve ambivalence. Compared with non-directive counseling, it's more focused and goal-directed. The examination and resolution of ambivalence is its central purpose, and the counselor is intentionally directive in pursuing this goal. In this way, motivational interviewing is designed to enhance a client's motivation to change using strategies that are empathic and non-confrontational. So this broad definition is really critical as we move forward to acknowledge that the fundamental purpose of MI is to help our clients make some kind of behavior change by creating an environment that is both supportive and directive to help guide them through ambivalence. We're not trying to make the decision for them. Rather, we're trying to help them understand the problem differently in order for them to make the decision and to take action. So to do this, we need to first understand the fundamental components or the spirit of motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is more than the use of a set of technical interventions. It's also relational and characterized by a way of being with the client. So this relational dimension is referred to as the spirit of MI, and it has four main components. As you're all familiar, motivational interviewing consists of a number of acronyms which help to reinforce all the different aspects of the approach. And in this instance, the spirit of MI is often described using the acronym of PACE: Partnership, Acceptance, Compassion, and Evocation. So starting at the top of this diagram, the first component is partnership. Partnership refers to collaboration, which means working in partnership with the client. And remembering that we don't add people, rather we use MI with people. Acceptance or autonomy is the second component. In general, if people think that they're making changes for their own reasons, they're more likely to maintain new behaviors. The opposite of autonomy support is making people do things or coercing and trying to control them. The third sphere relates to compassion. In showing compassion, we actively promote the other's welfare and give priority to their needs. This requires an awareness of what is of benefit to the client, which can only be achieved by knowing the client. And finally, evocation is the fourth component. In this dimension, we believe that the resources for change and motivation are presumed to reside within the individual. We want our client in an active speaking role rather than in a passive listening role. The primary purpose of utilizing motivational interviewing strategies is ultimately to be able to help evoke change with the individual. So combined, these four components make up the spirit of motivational interviewing. So when learning motivational interviewing, either for the first or the fourth time, it can feel overwhelming with a number of acronyms and steps that are involved in the process. So this is a quick checklist to the building blocks of MI. So some things for you to keep in mind. How am I contributing to building a positive partnership for change to occur with the client? Am I creating an environment of acceptance and being supportive to the change process? Is my care and concern being conveyed in a genuine manner? And am I using my skills to support the client to recognize their own strengths and ability to evoke change for themselves? You may not be able to remember all of the processes and techniques of MI, but if you incorporate the spirit of MI in all of your interactions with the individuals and families you serve, you will already have gone a long way to creating change. And so this quote from Stanley Kubrick, who is a critically acclaimed American filmmaker, really sums up the intent of trying to implement MI in that it matters more to a client in how we can make them feel through the process rather than specifically what we do. In this regard, if we focus our effort on how we can help clients to feel supported, heard, and empowered, the greater ability they have to hear their options, activate their strengths, and make positive change. The basic assumptions of MI differ from traditional or typical counseling because of the spirit, which we just discussed. Motivational interviewing is a counseling style that is geared primarily to help support people move through ambivalence towards change. It's always important to remember that ambivalence about change is normal and best described as a state of wanting and not wanting something at the same time, or wanting two incompatible things. Ambivalence is when we feel two ways about something. So with its foundations in recovery, MI would be helpful in resolving ambivalence around drinking, in trying to help someone to explore why they like to drink and also don't like to have a hangover after they drink. But what we know through working with people is that ambivalence occurs in all kinds of situations and can relate to all types of decisions which require change. And because of this, it is very important to remember and to reinforce with our clients that ambivalence is normal and a natural part of the human experience. However, a person's ambivalence about taking action is great material they can use as a basis for further discussion and intervention. Ambivalence is normal when people are confronted with the possibility of changing their circumstances, even when the evidence in favor of change is clear or even overwhelming. MI is designed to support individuals through a decision by first helping them understand the reason for their ambivalence, explore the underlying values and issues that are driving their ambivalence, and to help build trust so that they can more neutrally explore these conflicts and become more receptive to change and suggestions. Because our values often drive our desire for change, it's critical that clients are aware of these values that underpin the choices in their circumstances. Likewise, it's equally important for us as helpers that we are aware of, receptive to, and non-judgmental towards the personal values of our clients, which may offer insight into their ambivalence and choices. The very thought of making some kind of change can sometimes feel overwhelming. Take a moment to recall for yourself a time in your own life when you needed to make change. It may have been related to adopting a healthier lifestyle, like starting a diet or stopping smoking, a change in employment, or perhaps ending a relationship. In my experience, any change that takes time to commit to, even though a person may be thinking about changing, actually doing something about it or making an effort to change is really hard. Even when we may know at some deep level that this change is important and necessary, it still often comes with some ambivalence and uncertainty. So keeping our own personal experiences with making a change in mind, or recalling instances where we may have supported others to make a change, what we universally observe is that no one can make a person change. People may be ready to engage with you, but not ready to change. They may want to change in one moment and then seem to change their mind the next. Personal autonomy is everything, and people have a right not to change. Motivation to change must always be elicited from the client and really can't be imposed externally. The three most important determinants of motivation which impact change are importance, confidence, and readiness. Forcing someone to make change through the use of advice giving, threats, and confrontation are never effective. And it's very important when working with clients to avoid the righting reflex, which is basically trying to make things better for them, to try and right the situation for them. When working with individuals to resolve their ambivalence, motivational interviewing relies upon identifying and mobilizing the client's intrinsic values and goals to stimulate behavior change. The therapist's role in MI is directive, with the goal of eliciting self-motivational statements and behavioral change from the client, in addition to creating client discrepancy to enhance motivation for positive change. An important theoretical contribution to motivational interviewing also comes from James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente's development of the trans-theoretical model, which is also more commonly referred to as the stages of change, which a lot of us are already familiar with. Understanding the stages of change model and accurately assessing the stage the individual is at with regards to the particular behavior being assessed for change is critical to determine the tasks we face when working with them through this change. Failing to focus on the tasks of the appropriate stage can lead to disengagement and predictable failure. We'll just briefly go through these intersections of stage, readiness, and task in the following chart. When clients are pre-contemplative about making a change, they're typically unaware of the problem, and therefore our task is simply to help raise awareness of the problem for them and start to instill some discrepancy in their behaviors and values. Clients contemplating change are now aware of the problem, but are still weighing the risks and benefits of making a change. It's at this stage that the use of a decisional balance is most helpful to assist them with more clearly seeing the pros and cons of their action or inaction. Once they've decided to make a change, clients move towards preparing a plan. Here they're ready and willing to embark on making a change, and we want to help them in this process by supporting them in the creation of a plan and SMART goals. And with this plan in mind, clients can then move into action by activating their plan and actively taking steps towards making the desired change. And finally, once they've worked through their plan and have successfully made the desired change, clients are most concerned about maintaining this new change and incorporating it into their lifestyle by developing strategies to sustain this change. I think you've all supported clients that have been in all of these stages and are quite familiar with the associated challenges each stage brings. But one thing worth emphasizing here is that people can be in different stages of change for different behaviors simultaneously. So for example, a woman in an abusive relationship who also abuses substances may be contemplating sobriety, but be pre-contemplative about ending her abusive relationship. It's very important, therefore, that we're clear about which behaviors we're addressing and that it's aligned with what our client is interested in working on. If understanding the stage of change is important to determining our approach with clients, then it's critical that we understand what change our client is contemplating making. In this way, active listening is core to working with clients interested in any type of change. Active listening requires the listener to hear, evaluate, and interpret the content of a conversation. By being able to focus on what another person is saying, you can understand their needs and information more accurately. So if that wasn't good reason enough to support active listening, here are a few more. It helps to build relationship through connection and trust, helps to identify and solve problems, ensures that you understand the issues by increasing your knowledge of the situation and minimizing the chance that you may miss information or misinterpret information and communication. So some key skills to active listening, which are pretty basic and that you're all pretty familiar with, is to simply pay attention, withhold judgment, be mindful of nonverbal cues, slow down to be curious, avoid distractions, and always listen to understand. The purpose for and the skills of active listening are pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, there are many more roadblocks to active listening that impede our ability to really connect with and understand our clients. Without realizing it, I think we've all used some of these approaches at some time or another and perhaps wondered why progress was difficult or clients didn't respond as we would have liked. Let's take a look at some of these very common roadblocks to active listening. Advice giving, arguing, commanding, and judging are some obvious barriers to building connection and trust with our clients. And as if that weren't enough, here are a few more familiar roadblocks. So many of these roadblocks, as we notice, may have been with good intentions, such as offering praise or using humor to build connection. But what we don't realize is how this sometimes shifts the focus away from the client's intrinsic motivation or intention and redirects it either to our approval of them or minimizes the impact on them. So given all of these identified roadblocks, it can feel difficult to know what to say or worrisome at times that you might be saying the wrong thing. But a basic rule of thumb is to always keep the client in the center of the process. What motivational interviewing offers is a helpful structure to these conversations and some basic yet very transferable interviewing skills that can be used with all types of clients and in all situations. Adrian will now take us in for a deeper look at the core interviewing skills of motivational interviewing and then how to apply them in practice. So I'm just gonna toss him the ball here.
You should be seeing core interviewing skills. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, Robyn. I think your review of active listening really helps to better inform us on our understanding of our next topic, ORs. Um, the backbone of motivational interviewing are those core skills which help to guide the conversation to really elicit more information. So it's really an opportunity to better understand our clients' values, their beliefs, preferences, and ultimately the progression towards making a change. So these core skills are referred to by the easy acronym of ORS, which reflect the following elements: open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening statements, and summarizations. And the blending of these core skills, along with the spirit of motivational interviewing, really creates the art of conversation between yourself, the social service provider, and the client. And I think most of us in this profession, this helping profession, already have this kind of natural MI like style, which has drawn us into this work. So I tend to believe that some of this is not new that you're hearing. And we've alluded to that earlier. But what's important is that we have to be intentional and we have to be mindful in using all the core skills. And in the next few slides, we'll go over what these core skills are in a little bit more depth. So open-ended questions can't be answered by merely yes or no or by one-word answers. And in doing so, it requires the person to think about how to answer. These types of questions psychologically lead people to answer more fully and more honestly, which results in our clients, I think, sharing more about their beliefs, experiences, their values, and their feelings than they might otherwise. To be most effective, open-ended questions land on client change talk and are client-centered by utilizing information that we have about their life, their needs, their desires, preferences, and ideas, right? So open-ended questions by nature are designed to be intriguing. So even if the client chooses not to answer or is not very thoughtful in their response, they may be stimulated or encouraged to think differently or more or with more awareness about the nature of their problem. And again, in doing so, these questions often result in them thinking more deeply about an issue, which will hopefully lead to some movement out of their ambivalence. And again, if we go back to some earlier slides where we know that ambivalence to change is normal, right? It's this state of having these mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone. So some things to remember when asking open-ended question is to avoid this interrogation technique or this rapid-firing questioning, and to remember to pause, between questions, take a moment to reflect back to your client on what they just said. And keeping our work with homeless members in mind, let's take a look at the difference between closed and open-ended questions that we might utilize in our work and consider what kind of response we may get. So open-ended questions allow us to get more information, to better understand the people we work with. Uh, we want to understand their ambivalence about engaging in the activity we're working with them on, and how that might help us in future interventions with them. So let's take a look at our first example. Don't you want to find housing? To how do you think things will be different for you if you found housing? You see the difference? The second sentence, the question allows you to elicit a greater response that may provide more insight into the member's current situation or how they might be feeling. And how about this one? Wouldn't it be so much better off the street? And then, what are some of the benefits of getting housed? Or what are some negative things about finding housing? Again, really a greater opportunity to seek to understand rather than be understood. And then we have a few more examples of closed and open-ended questions here. All these questions are really additional chances for us to build on our understanding of the people we're working with and their challenges. Uh, Open-ended questions help us to recognize those barriers that exist for our homeless consumers. For instance, in getting access to healthcare or achievement of any personal or clinical goals, and really identifying their paths to recovery. So again, how we ask our questions can really set us up for successful interactions in the future. Affirmations send a powerful message to our client that you're not only listening to them, but you're listening for something positive, and telling them what positive thing you learned about them. I think for many clients who've grown accustomed to, continuous disappointment, rejection, living in this kind of marginalized community or culture, hearing something positive is kind of rare, and can even be uncomfortable for them to hear. Yeah. So through these simple statements, we can not only build connection, but we can also kind of foster hope for individuals facing what can seem to be some insurmountable challenges. Affirmations are statements, they're gestures that recognize client strengths, and they acknowledge behaviors that lead us in then or the member in the direction of positive change, really no matter how big or small it is. They're generally statements that are intended to uh, build on connection with our clients by conveying that we're actively listening, right? We're trying to understand their thoughts and their feelings and beliefs. And lastly, affirmations build confidence in one's ability to change. So, to be effective, affirmations must be genuine and congruent. And in our efforts to support clients in their progress, I think we often mix up offering affirmations from praises. Praising clients is often difficult to avoid in our genuine relief and satisfaction when people are starting to make this great change or this positive movement, right? And so we don't realize it at the time that these praises most times result in kind of these short-term gains if the motivation for these improvements are based on our delivery of praise and not really intrinsically felt by our clients. So when we use affirmations, our focus is on the client, and our intentions are to motivate. Where offering praise tends to focus on our response to the client's actions and often serve as roadblocks to change and connection. So there's a difference, and we'll go over that a little bit more here in the next few slides. As I just mentioned, it's sometimes hard to tell if we're affirming the positive actions taken by a client, or are we just praising them for doing a good job. And the easiest way to tell if you're offering praise is to notice if you're using I statements. I'm proud of you. I'm so happy for you. And sometimes praises are dressed up as affirmations and might sound like this. Good job keeping an appointment, or now you're making progress. And while these examples of statements are not necessarily I statements, they still convey this sense of approval of the action that was taken, which in turn relays this sense of judgment. So instead of that, consider using statements that keep the focus on the client. You made it here today and on time, or how about you're clearly a resourceful person? And I think while these statements seem less personal, right, as you're reading this and thinking about it, and counter to our personal feelings that I think are aligned with just our aloha spirit and culture, I think it can be challenging for us to implement when we're out in the field. That being said, I also believe that it highlights and it retains the focus on the client's strengths and motivation, and that was under their personal control. And I think that's what's most important, right? So flipping praise to affirmation is often tricky and takes practice. And the best way to distinguish the two is to start by considering two things. The first is what I'm saying, is this statement focused on the actions or on the response of the client? And the second is this statement relaying some kind of judgment on my part? You know, I think theory and application sometimes feels miles apart. And again, a simple suggestion is working with your teammate, your supervisor, and really the use of role playing as a starting point to get familiar with it. So listening and interpreting what is heard isn't always easy, right? A reflection is a hypothesis that the listener makes about what the speaker is saying, and there are different types of reflections that we'll discuss briefly in the next few slides. But in general, um, reflections simply relay to our client that hey, we're listening. We understand what they're saying is connected to some deeper feeling, and again that we want to understand. I think reflective listening is such a primary skill in outreach, and you guys already do it. I think it's one of the critical foundations to engaging others in a meaningful relationship. It's key to building trust and fostering this motivation to change and hope. So reflective listening, it appears easy, but it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of skill to do and to do it well. So I think conversations void of reflections, no matter how wonderful the open-ended questions are, may eventually feel sort of like this nice interrogation. Those skilled in motivational interviewing, offer about 2 to 3 reflections on average for every question asked. Right? And a well-formed reflection lets your client know that hey, I'm listening, and it also allows a check-in to verify what you've heard and that you've understood them correctly. And the beauty about this is that if you didn't get it right, it will still offer the client the opportunity to share more clarification and meaning in the conversation. So in this way, you have the ability to kind of direct and steer the conversation through the use of reflections, either by consciously choosing what to reflect on or to ignore. So when offering reflections, it's important to be mindful of our tone and inflection of our voice affects the meaning and interpretation of statements. So particularly in Hawaii, it's sometimes difficult to tell whether a statement is being made or if a question is being asked, as our tone is often very similar. Right? What we try to look for to distinguish between a question and a statement is for our tone to go up at the end of a question. So an example of this is, you're sad. Conversely, tones often gently go down at the end of a reflection. And in the same example, a statement would sound like, you're sad. Asking a question and making a statement will elicit a very different response from a client, and we need to be intentional when using reflections as part of motivational interviewing. So in these instances, we are intending to make a reflective statement. So our tone should go down at the end of a statement. You're sad. This is intended not only to reflect back that feeling that the client is experiencing, but also hopefully, right, we're hoping that it further elicits a broader discussion and conversation about how they're feeling. And let's take one more example. First, here's what it might sound like as a question. You don't think you have a problem with drugs? But as a reflective statement, it would sound like you don't think you have a problem with drugs. The same sentence stated very differently will likely give very different reactions. As mentioned previously, there are 2 main types of reflective listening, and we could probably spend, quite a bit of time talking about just the different types of reflections. So we're just going to be reviewing the basics for today. And the 2 main types of reflections are called simple and complex reflections. Simple reflections are really the most basic and involve simply just repeating back to the client the statements that they've made, which you want to highlight or get more of an understanding of. Simple reflections are good for confirming, understanding content, but they don't convey this understanding of deeper, more emotional meaning. Uh, they are best used when you want to keep the conversation going, as it's not necessarily a guide to, as it's not necessarily a guide in any particular direction. A simple reflection would be used when you repeat what a person has said or slightly rephrase what a person has said. For example, if a person says, I'm angry, you would simply relay back to them matter of factly, you're angry. Or you would slightly rephrase it as, you don't seem to be happy with the way things are. If we think about what is communicated, we can use that analogy of an iceberg, and a simple reflection would be focusing what simply on what is said or what can be seen kind of above the water, right? Um, Complex reflections get more at the meaning and the feeling behind what is said. In that same iceberg analogy, it would be, you know, what's below the water surface, right? So complex reflections are best used when you want to prevent conversations from going around in circles, and bringing it back to that central point. And if you want to add meaning to the client's words to make this kind of deeper connection. So in this way, complex reflections are used when you want to actively guide the conversation towards change. And there are several different types of complex reflections, and we'll cover a couple today. The first is amplified reflections, and they're designed to highlight emotional content of the communication. And in this way, we're kind of overshooting a simple statement that was made by a client and kind of hypothesizing the feeling behind the statement. So if a client were to state, I get beat up sometimes at night on the streets, and I don't even see it coming. I lose all my stuff. An amplified reflection might be something like, "It's dangerous out there, and it must be scary not being able to let your guard down." Right? Double-sided reflections are designed to highlight the individual's ambivalence. This helps the client to see both the positive and the negative from a more objective perspective. Um, an example might be, on one hand, not having to pay for rent and housing expenses gives you more money and freedom. And then on the other hand, not having a permanent and safe place to live often puts you in some pretty dangerous situations. And by seeing his or her own attitude in a new way, a client, they might have this greater awareness and motivation to change, and might reduce the negative consequences of their situation. The final core skill of MI, the purpose of summarizing is to link what has been discussed. Summarizing consists of bringing together the essence of what a client has expressed and communicating it back as a recap of the meeting. A summary that links the client's positive and negative feelings can facilitate an understanding on initial ambivalence, and really promote a perception of discrepancy. Um, I think while many think of summarizing at the end of a session, summaries can be very effective used at the beginning of a conversation, really to bring the focus of the previous meeting. Formulating a summary, I think, in the middle of a session can also be very helpful if the client seems overwhelmed or if the conversation has seemed to have lost focus, right? And summarizations tighten up the focus of the conversation, create this smooth transition to bridging, the formation of next steps, and can really amplify the desire, ability, the reason, need, and commitment to change. And for those familiar with the acronym DARN-C in the MI process, that's what it is. So again, really important, I think, to summarize it really as an option for any point in the conversation. Personally, I like to summarize at the beginning as a reminder of where we left off on our last conversation, um, which I referenced above. It helps me to level set with whoever I'm working with and say, hey, we're going to start here today, at this point. And in these next few slides, we're going to use a couple of case studies to help introduce a useful tool called the decisional balance. Um, Using the decisional balance helps the client and provider, or you and I, really understand the costs and benefits, I think, of either staying the same or making a change, right? So I think as a provider, understanding ambivalence helps to understand where our members are in that change process that Robbyn kind of walked us through. It can help identify the appropriate intervention strategies and gain some insight into their perception of the situation. So I think as you work through this on your own, or whether you're facilitating it with someone you're working with, you begin to see how difficult change and ambivalence can be. And again, the objective is really helping the client recognize and weigh negative aspects of his or her behavior so that we can, move them towards a positive change. And here's our first case example. I think John's situation seems pretty familiar to all of us. He's chronically homeless. He's transient. He's used multiple social service providers during his time spent without a home. Among the things that John has to deal with are multiple health conditions, um, which undoubtedly create barriers for him achieving and sustaining seems like any positive momentum with any type of recovery goals, right? We get the sense that John is frustrated, and perhaps he believes the system has failed him in the ways listed here. But you guys are vigilant, right? And you understand how important your support is towards working with him on his long-term recovery, and continue to outreach him sometimes more frequently, weekly, or so. You understand that like evidence-based practices like motivational interviewing that has been introduced to you over your time in social service has been helpful in preparing you to deal with really the complexities that characterize someone who is experiencing homelessness. And the decisional balance tool helps John understand his ambivalence, and maybe offers John an opportunity to see the benefits to making a change. And here is our decisional balance tool. So I've seen this presented in a number of different ways, and in this way here I have this kind of quadrant-like format. I've also seen it listed out horizontally in columns. For me, I like this way because I think this is the way I think, and I also think it helps me to better visualize someone's movement through change. Uh, I like to start in this top left quadrant where I ask myself or the client, what are the benefits to kind of staying the same? And then I would move towards the next section in this kind of clockwise motion where I would try to figure out what this person has experienced consequences with kind of staying stuck in homelessness. And as I fill those in, I move towards identifying consequences to making that said change. And lastly, always ending with the benefits to making that positive shift. With that in mind, let's start here at the top with those pros that come with not changing. And as you can see here, John's reasons, they sound pretty familiar for someone who's experienced homelessness for some time, right? Uh, what's listed here is primarily themes around primarily financial insecurity, and really describes a person who has been acclimated to living in chaos. And as we move to the next area, we examine some of the consequences to staying the same, right? And yet again, are a few familiar reasons that we may have either observed our clients experience as a result of living on the street, right? We see violence, we see use of emergency services, interactions with our police department, and really making hard choices monthly and daily that have this long lasting impact on our overall health and wellness. We start to move towards identifying, those consequences, making a positive change, right? And you begin to see and outline how even a positive change can create these difficult decisions, right? John describes his ambivalence around an unfamiliarity with living in someplace new, right? Less financial freedom and negative stigma that comes with homelessness. We're familiar with that. And lastly, we move into his positive reasons for making a change. For John, the reasons can be safety, increased access and greater support towards healthcare, social entitlement stability that comes with simply a mailing address, hot meals more regularly, and improved hygiene. And all these reasons we list out hopefully provide the client some insight into making that change. And in our second case, we took a look at Jane, who's a homeless mother of three living in her car for the past half year, right? Our community is familiar with Jane because of her children and the use of our activity centers and shelter programs for hygiene maintenance. Jane's situation is made worse because she's involved in a domestic violent relationship that has resulted and contributed to her substance use need. We know that treatment programs for females with children are difficult to find and get into. In addition to that, they risk leaving the children displaced or involved in child welfare services. Like many of our members do, they face significant challenges once they're housed and often need multiple housing opportunities before they start to experience success. Miss Jane is finally able to find the courage and time to walk into your agency where she's screened for services. And then, based on your agency's assessment, you identified the need to support this family who's involved in this violent relationship. And motivational interviewing helps gain insight into her complex relationship with her spouse, recognize barriers to overcoming her family's homelessness situation, and really identify other areas of growth that can help her in this recovery process. And again, we see the decisional balance tool here outlining her path to change, right? And then starting at the top, here are Jane's reasons for not wanting to change, right? You can see a lot of her decision to stay is factored around her relationship and safety for herself and children. And I think we can begin to see how difficult leaving relationships can be for those involved in domestic violence. And then you add homelessness and then substance use and children's safety. It's a really difficult to see a way out at times. And as we begin to outline the consequences for staying the same, right, we begin to see an all too familiar picture that our female members face living on the streets. Some of the problems that lead to truancy for children attending school, the shadow of child welfare services that hangs over families' heads, and of course, safety concerns that are no different from what parents feel for their children, right? Regardless of if you're homeless or housed. And now, as we move towards the consequences to making a change, you see the shift and the ambivalence around uncertainty of something new and unfamiliar. New school, loss of culture, even homelessness has a culture, right? Financial insecurity, greater responsibility. I think all reasonable, all significant for our members. And as we move towards this last bucket, we have the benefits Jane may experience to making a positive change. Right? And the reasons listed here offer hope. I think attempts to satisfy her concerns around the welfare of her family, and empowers Jane to be supported in her pursuit of her wellness. So as we wind down this presentation, these next two slides review some of what we learned here today. I think much more concisely about what motivational interviewing behavior should be present as we start to implement this into our practice. We want change talk. We want to elicit it. We want to positively respond to it. We want to support it. We want to keep the conversation going with our members. I think there's so much rich information that helps us to understand what our members are going through. In the end, this is a partnership, right? It's a shared relationship. And the member brings his subject matter expertise in the lived experience arena, and we're there to offer support. We help them identify their strengths that may seem buried at times, and help them overcome barriers to achieving clinical and personal goals. And lastly, we want to, as much as possible, demonstrate empathy, right, through the use of reflections and affirmations. Both allow us to communicate to the client that, hey, we're listening to them and we're confirming understanding of what they're saying, understanding of content, and also while concurrently avoiding pitfalls, like to active listening, like praising and persuading and ordering. And here are just a few more practical implementation tips for you folks to keep in mind when you're working with your members. So we want to be active listeners. We want to reassure that ambivalence is normal, right? That we're really asking for permission to provide feedback, right? Asking permission demonstrates respect. It gives our members control whether or not to hear what you have to say. And if they decline, there's always an opportunity to explore that response as well. So a lot of good stuff that can come with uh, both sides, right? And then lastly, are we coming from a place where we're seeking to understand rather than be understood? And I know you've heard that a lot in these last 50 minutes, but it's something that's I use as a reminder that helps guide me in my practice. Remembering that we should always be coming from a strength-based perspective. We should be cognizant of what messages we're trying to convey with the people we work with. And finally, how do our responses help to promote hope and recovery? And that's it. Any questions? If you can drop them in the chat or um, I don't know, but that's really all we have
Okay.
right now.
I don't see any questions. The only questions they had was a copy of the PowerPoint, but the session is being recorded. It will be available at a later date. I'm not sure if you guys have a copy of the PowerPoint that people can have access to. Okay, let's
Robbyn, you want to
see.
take a stab at that? Is she on? She went sleep.
Okay.
Sorry,
Robbyn,
I
oh, there
was
you are.
talking to myself. I was busy talking to myself. We can make it available. We just need to figure out who to send it to.
Okay, okay, we can follow up with that then. And for those of you, thank you all for joining us. You can go back to the conference page to find other links to the other sessions that should be starting at 11 o'clock.
Danny, I see a quick
Yeah.
question from there about whether or not MI is applicable for
Okay,
use
hold
with
on.
children. And
Oh, there we
it
go.
is actually, yeah, because these are just basic interviewing skills and the approach of being client-centered, creating this safe space. It actually works well with children and adults across the whole age continuum. But great question.
Oh, now I see it. There it is. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes if anybody else has any questions. Okay. Everyone's saying thank you. No more questions. But everybody's thanking both of you for an awesome presentation. So that's coming in through the chat. Okay. I don't think there's any more questions. Just a lot of thank you. There is one. Does this work well with clients in structured programs? So places where clients need to follow rules to be in the program, but still want to work towards listing well. Any of you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, so again, it's really, even in structured programs. I'm sorry, Adrian. Do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Robbyn.
I think even in structured programs, people, kids or adults, they're faced with choices, and ultimately they're going to leave the program at some point. So helping them to prepare for that, and honoring and really getting them in touch and understanding what their values, which are driving their decisions, is basically what MI is about. So I've seen it also used in probation. So kids or adults who have POs or are on probation, it's still looking at the decisional balance of helping people move through change, whether it's change in criminal behavior or it's change in the decisions of how they want to, what their general lifestyle will be like. So it's really broadly applicable to recovery from substances, all kinds of stuff, homelessness.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that. I think there are certain things, components like the decisional balance too. I think was helpful. I think anytime you want to demonstrate empathy or make a more meaningful connection, there are certain parts of MI that you want to maybe use to gain more insight and to make that more deeper and meaningful connection in that healthy therapeutic relationship. So, yeah, I think it's applicable in so many situations. That's just what I feel.
Okay. Anything else? He said thank you. That helps. Thanks, Robbyn. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Danny.